This video is brought to you by my fantastic supporters over at Patreon. Go to patreon.com/TJTheEmperor to find out how you can support the channel.
Hi friends. So I haven't made any anime related videos since the final History of Gainax episode dropped at the end of last year. And even outside of that, I haven't really put out as much anime related content as I personally would have liked. So this year I want to make a goddamn concerted effort to fix that. But what should I focus on? I mean, I could become another shameless trend chaser and make videos on all the flavor of the month seasonal shit, but no. I've long realized my brand lies in focusing on subjects that are guaranteed to keep a large audience as far from my channel as possible. So to that end, I think there's only one real genre I need to focus on.
Robots.
As I'm sure anyone who's watched my History of Gainax or Xenogears Reference Guide series can tell, I'm kind of a big fan of giant robots. I always have been. This puts me outside the norm of most American anime fans, since, as a rule, otaku on this side of the Pacific have never really been that into robot shows. I mean, of course, there are exceptions. There were those couple of years in the early 2000s when Gundam Wing was one of the most popular shows in the country, and there was that time in the mid-80s when Voltron and Robotech wormed their way into the pop cultural zeitgeist, but like, most people at the time had no idea that Voltron and Robotech were even Japanese, so does that even really count? Because of this historical lack of familiarity with the genre, I think part of the reason why giant robot anime remains so inaccessible is because it's hard to know where to start. The genre has a decades-long history, and most of its key shows have, until relatively recently, not been translated into English. Thankfully, because of fan subs and the fine folks over at Discotech, this isn't so much of an issue anymore, but that still doesn't make it any easier to know where to start. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I get the impression that other anime fans look at the giant robot otaku as somewhat intimidating, like they're the kind of crowd that would look down on you for daring to ask basic questions like, what should my first super robot show be? Ooh, scary. Again, I could be wrong about that, but either way, I want this video to be an approachable introduction to the genre. Before we start, though, if you've seen any of my video game recommendation lists, you know I always have to start with a few rules for how I made my choices, so let's get that over with. First, as the title suggests, this video is just going to focus on super robot shows. If you're not familiar with the term, super robot shows are the more over-the-top, superhero-style robot anime, where science and logic are thrown out the window and all that matters is whether or not you can scream your attack names really loud. I mentioned Voltron earlier, that's a super robot show. If you're looking for recommendations for shows like Gundam, those are real robot shows, and I'll make a vid about those someday. Second, I'm going to give a decent spread of older and newer shows. Third, I'm going to skew my picks to shorter shows, but realistically, there's only so much of that I can do. A lot of giant robot shows, especially older ones, are long, and if you want to get into the genre, you just have to accept that. For that reason, I will include a couple of longer shows on this list, but for the most part, I'm going to stick to shorter stuff, as I rightly believe that's the more accessible route to take. Other than that, though, that's basically it, so without further ado, let's get into it. Now, with these recommendation videos, generally I don't arrange my picks in any particular order, but for this one, I specifically chose my first pick as my first pick because I 100% want you to start here. The show in question is the 2000 OVA, Shin Getter-Robo vs. Neo Getter-Robo. To me, Shin Getter vs. Neo Getter is the perfect introduction to the super robot genre. It looks gorgeous, its action scenes are top rate, and at only 4 episodes you can watch the entire thing in one sitting, which for a super robot show is almost unheard of. Technically, yes, it does act as a sequel to the original Getter-Robo series from the 70s, but the opening gives enough information such that even someone completely unfamiliar with the lore of Getter-Robo will be able to follow along. Basically, the 3 pilots of the Getter-Robo, Ryoma Nagare, Hayato Jin, and Musashi Tomoe, are fighting their ultimate battle against their mortal enemies, the Dinosaur Empire, in the streets of New York. Musashi, understanding the battle will only be won through great sacrifice, destroys the Getter Core, which not only destroys himself and most of the Dinosaur Empire, but also the entire city of New York in the process. In the aftermath, all research into Getter Rays, Getter-Robo's power source, is banned, and the Getter Team's headquarters, Sao Tome Labs, is converted into a branch of the JSSDF called NISAR. Hayato is brought on board as Nisar's leader, and when he learns the Dinosaur Empire is planning a return, he gathers a new team to pilot Neo-Getter Robo, a brand new robot that runs on plasma power. It's a pretty basic plot, but one thing you're going to realize pretty quickly is that most Super Robot shows are pretty much all variations on this exact theme. You're not going to watch these shows for the complexity of their narrative. What matters are the memorable characters, the theme of standing up for justice and righteousness no matter how insurmountable the odds, and of course, the complete balls to the wall, I don't give a fuck, logic be damned attitude to its action. And Shin Getter vs. Neo Getter has all that in spades. This is a show that will not let you down for a single second. The stakes are always high and the characters are all memorable, both the returning veterans and the new heroes. Special attention must be paid to Jack and Mary King, the greatest over-the-top American characters in anime history, bar none. Episode 2 is heavily focused on them, and honestly, that episode alone is worth the price of admission for the entire series. So yes, if this is your first exposure to the Super Robot genre, start with Shin Getter vs. Neo Getter. When it comes to anime, it's hard to think of a better use of 2 hours of your time. Alright, for my second pick, this is probably the obvious choice for a list of this kind, and as I'm sure you've guessed, it's the 2007 Gainax masterpiece Tengen Toppa Gurren Lagann. Full disclosure, I've discussed this show in greater detail as part of the last episode of my History of Gainax series, so if you want to hear me go off for over 20 minutes just on Gurren Lagann, here's a link. But for everyone else, Gurren Lagann was the big break for animator-director Hiroyuki Imaishi, now known as the fearless leader of Studio Trigger. Planned as a massive homage to the entire history of the giant robot genre, the story focuses on Simone, a boy from Giha village who, together with his Aniki Kamina, commandeers a giant robot and winds up forming a massive resistance movement against the evil Spiral King. If there's one Super Robot show that's penetrated the consciousness of anime fans, Gurren Lagann is it. I know I said earlier that American otaku generally don't care about robot shows, but Gurren Lagann is a massive exception to that rule, for good reason. Even for those completely unfamiliar with the genre, the combination of its signature visual style and over-the-top action scenes left all who watched it captivated. This is still, nearly 20 years after the fact, one of the greatest looking animated television shows I've ever seen. But the show is not simply a series of action set pieces. The characters are some of the most memorable in the genre, and the story, without getting heavy into spoilers, covers ground that most other shows of its ilk would be happy to leave by the wayside. Specifically, the notion that just because you've killed the big bad you spent the entire series trying to defeat, that doesn't automatically guarantee you a permanent happy ending. You have to actually put in the work to build a better world in the process. I said it in my History of Gainax series, and I stand by it here. Gurren Lagann is one of the most uplifting shows I've ever seen. It's one that I can put on no matter how bad I feel, and I'll end up feeling better by the end, and I guarantee that if you watch it, you'll feel the same way. Next, I want to take us back to the 90s, and recommend another show that's considered to be one of the greatest in the genre's history. The King of Braves, Gao-Gaigar. Now, I need to give a bit of context here. Gao-Gaigar is the final installment of a long-running franchise called the Brave series. If you've never heard of the Brave series, I don't blame you. It was a massive collaboration between mecha powerhouse studio Sunrise and toy conglomerate Takara, best known as the creators of the Transformers. Deliberately designed to appeal to very young children, ratings initially started strong, but as the Brave series continued through the years, they gradually declined, as the children who had historically watched Super Robot shows were moving on to other forms of entertainment, especially video games. Most of the Brave series was forgotten as a result. In fact, I'd argue the only real legacy of the franchise's pre-Gao-Gaigar history is that one scene in episode 3 of Brave of the Sun Fiber that launched the "Is it an X" meme. By the time Gao-Gaigar debuted in 1997, Sunrise basically knew it was going to be the final entry in the Brave series, so they went all out, and boy did that work pay off. Story-wise, it's pretty standard. A boy named Mamoru is brought to a human couple by a mysterious mechanical lion. Years later, the Earth is invaded by an alien race called the Zonders. Standing in their way is the Gutsy Geoid Guard, or 3G, and their ace in the hole, Gai Shishio, a hot-blooded cyborg who transforms into the mighty Gao-Gaigar. Mamoru and Guy become friends, which is convenient since it turns out Mamoru has the power to purify the Zonders. Again, nothing too groundbreaking, but Gao-Gaigar is a series that proves definitively that you don't need to be groundbreaking in order to be great. The show looks fantastic, which Discotech's recent Blu-ray set does a great job of showing off, and while the grand narrative may not be anything special, it does so much right in the details. Elements such as a subplot concerning Gao Gaigar being mortally threatened by his dividing driver attack adds an element of drama not found in other shows of its kind, and I must give the staff credit for their talent in crafting some of the most insane cliffhangers I've ever seen. Seriously, you're going to be glad Discotech released the entire show in one set. It is admittedly a bit long. At 49 episodes, it's the longest show I'm going to recommend in this video, but don't let that, or its relatively more conventional opening episodes, turn you off. Just keep watching. I guarantee that once you're several episodes in, you're not going to want to stop. Alright, a Super Robot recommendation list has to include at least one series from the 70s, and my choice is going to be Voltus 5. Now, this is a show that, like Gao Gaigar, needs a bit of contextual introduction. Voltus 5 is the second entry in what's called the Romantic Robot Trilogy, a series of 3 shows co-produced in the mid-70s by Sunrise and Toei. Whereas earlier Super Robot shows were almost hilariously simplistic in their portrayals of its characters, the Romantic Robot Trilogy introduced some bona fide human drama into its storytelling. Sure, they're relatively simple when looked at from a modern perspective, but for its time, it was a quantum leap forward. Voltus 5 is probably the best remembered entry in the trilogy. Just ask anyone in the Philippines, where the show became a runaway cultural phenomenon and had a not insignificant role in bringing down their former president, Ferdinand Marcos. Seriously, just Google it, it's wild. Anyway, the story concerns an invasion of Earth by aliens from the Boazon Empire. Commander Oka of the Earth Defense Force, alongside 2 brilliant Japanese scientists, creates the 5-person combining robot Voltus 5 as humanity's last hope of resistance against the Boazanians. Anyone who's seen Power Rangers will feel right at home with Voltus 5, given that it's a show about a group of 5 kids and their combining robot fighting a monster of the week sent to destroy humanity by an evil alien force. But despite this simplistic premise, the show is unafraid to tackle more complicated themes, including imperialism and racism. The villains, in particular, are extremely well developed, and particular praise must be given to Prince Heinel, the leader of the Boazanian invasion force, who is so phenomenally written that calling him a villain seriously sells him short. I'm being deliberately vague here, as I feel that of any of the shows on this list, this is the one I'm guessing you're probably the least familiar with, and thus the last thing I want to do is spoil anything. Needless to say, I think you're gonna love this story, although admittedly it may be hard for some of you to get into it. Voltus 5 is a show from the 70s, and for some, the aesthetic of 70s anime design may be a difficult barrier to overcome, especially if you're not used to it. Just try it though. It took me some time at first, but now I've come to appreciate the look of 70s robot shows in all their roughly animated charm. It's something you really haven't seen since the 70s and will likely never see again. Speaking of the 70s, let's talk about another legendary franchise from that decade, albeit an entry that comes from the early 2000s, Mazinkaiser. Kaiser. Mazinkaiser, as the name suggests, is an entry in the Mazinger franchise, which, although it didn't create the super robot genre, that honor belongs to Tetsugen 28, better known to the West as Gigantor, it did codify the genre's tropes for literally every show that followed in its wake. The problem, though, is that entries in the Mazinger franchise are kind of difficult to recommend to genre newbies. Mazinger Z, the franchise's debut series, is 92 episodes long, and subsequent series, while shorter, generally act as direct sequels to one another. Mazinkaiser is no exception to this. It's only 7 episodes long, but in a way, those 7 episodes act as a continuation of what happened in those series from the 70s. For that reason, I almost didn't include it here, but then I thought a list of introductory super robot shows without including Mazinger just felt wrong. So just to make sure you can follow the story no problem, here are the basics of what you need to know to understand Mazinkaiser and most other entries in the Mazinger franchise as a whole. This is Dr. Hell. You're never gonna believe this, but he's an evil mad scientist who wants to take over the world. Shocking, I know. Standing in his way is Koji Kabuto, the pilot of Mazinger Z, as well as his friends, most of whom also pilot giant robots. Sayaka, the pilot of Aphrodite A, Boss, the pilot of Boss Borat, June, the pilot of Venus A, and Tetsuya, the pilot of Great Mazinger. There, you're all set. In Mazinkaiser, an attack from Dr. Hell and his assistant Baron Ashura sees Great Mazinger basically totaled and Mazinger Z fallen into enemy hands. Thankfully, Koji is able to fight back using an even more powerful robot, the Mazinkaiser. And that's basically it. Unlike the other modern shows I've discussed in this video, Mazinkaiser is a lot more episodic. When I said earlier that it feels like a continuation of the 70s Mazinger shows, it really does feel like Mazinkaiser would be the logical end result if Mazinger Z continued production into the early 2000s. Hell, episode 4 is a shameless beach episode, for crying out loud. This admittedly took me a bit to get used to, as I was going into it expecting a bit more of a serialized storyline and not being quite as goofy, but if you're expecting all that, I don't think you're going to be as thrown off as I was. Which is good, because this is a really great show. Whether it's doing insane action, fan service, or goofy comedy, Mazinkaiser is nothing but entertaining all the way through. Alright, we're going to go back to the late 90s, because now I want to talk about The Big O. This is probably the most unique of all the shows on this list, because in addition to the standard super robot formula, The Big O takes heavy inspiration from film noir, hard-boiled detective stories, and Batman, especially Batman the Animated Series. The show is set in Paradigm City, a domed dystopia set to be the last surviving remnant of human civilization, and a place where its inhabitants can't remember anything prior to a mysterious incident from 40 years ago known only as the Event. Roger Smith, a former military policeman now working as a negotiator, fights crime alongside his butler Norman, his assistant R. Dorothy Wainwright, and his giant robot the Big O. Of all the shows on this list, this one is arguably the easiest for new fans to get into, because there's a lot more going on than in your standard super robot romp. If you want kick-ass mecha action scenes, there's plenty of that, don't get me wrong, but the main draw of the Big O is the mystery of Paradigm City, and trying to figure out what the hell is going on there. The show does a great job of balancing out that overarching mystery with plenty of memorable, one-shot episodes. If you're a fan of Ghost in the Shell standalone complex, it's kinda got the same structure, just replace the cyberpunk with noir mystery. Admittedly, and without getting into major spoilers, the revelations concerning the ultimate mysteries of Paradigm City are somewhat divisive, if only because the ending is rather unconventional. I'm not a huge fan of the term Gynax ending, but I've heard other fans throw it around, so that should tell you everything you need to know. This shouldn't stop you from watching the series, however, as there's still, even today, no other show that's quite like The Big O. The sense of style, the immaculate design work, it's like very few shows in the genre, and if you're a fan of English dubs, this one is a must-watch, as it's long been considered among the greatest ever made, and of course, it's a Kevin Seymour joint. And last, but certainly not least, I'm going to recommend something that most of you, I'm guessing, probably saw from a mile away, and that's Gunbuster. Now, again, this is another show I talked about at length in my History of Gynax series, and those of you who have seen that knows Gunbuster is among my favorite anime ever made. Despite that, this is another show, like Mazinkaiser, that I was this close to not including on this list, for a very simple reason. I don't think Gunbuster feels very much like a conventional super robot show. To me, it feels much closer in tone to classic sci-fi of the space battleship Yamato vein, or a precursor to the psychologically dense mecha shows that followed in the wake of Neon Genesis Evangelion, which is appropriate considering Gunbuster is the directorial debut of Evangelion's creator, Hideaki Anno. But again, like Mazinkaiser, not including Gunbuster on a list like this felt like a huge mistake. Plot-wise, Gunbuster is the story of Noriko Takaya, a teenage girl who strives to become a space pilot in order to follow in the footsteps of her father, an admiral who went missing during a mission several years previous. The only problem? Noriko is a singularly bad pilot candidate. Nevertheless, her new coach sees potential in her nobody else does, and shapes her, through the power of hard work and guts, into a member of the elite top squadron. I know, anyone who's seen this show knows that this is a terrible summary. So much happens in Gunbuster's 6-episode runtime it's pretty hard to discuss it in a concise manner, so I highly suggest you check out my video where I discuss it for almost an hour. Anyway, like The Big O, this is another show where robot action tends to take a back seat. Hell, the titular Gunbuster doesn't even appear in combat until episode 4. But if that's what you're looking for, don't you worry, because although there may not be a ton of action scenes in Gunbuster, when they do happen, they are stunningly well done. This is Gynax at the peak of their prime, after all. But really, what you want to watch Gunbuster for is because this is one of the most emotionally powerful stories you're ever going to experience in anime. Noriko's journey to become a better pilot and overcome her personal traumas, the two are inseparably linked, of course, will move you like very little else can. Seriously, if you don't tear up during the final episode, I will question whether or not you have a heart. There's a reason why Gunbuster is constantly judged to be not only among the greatest mecha anime ever made, but among the greatest anime ever made. Period. Watch it, and I guarantee that you'll agree. Alright, and there's my list of Super Robot show recommendations. I hope you're interested in checking out at least one of the shows I talked about here. If you do, I'll consider this video a success. Seriously, I've loved these kind of shows for about as long as I've been an anime fan, and I would be very happy if we could get more of a fan base on this side of the Pacific. Eventually, I'll do a video about real robot shows, so you can hear me nerd out about Gundam and Macross for the first time, and I guarantee you, it will not be the last time either. Oh, I guess I should also give a shout out to Discotech, who are almost single-handedly keeping mecha fandom in America going. They're not paying me to say this, but they do fantastic work, so they deserve a shout out. I'm pretty sure 5 of the 7 shows I talk about in this video were put out by Discotech, so if you're interested in any of them, by all means go to their website and throw money in their face. Alright, that's enough out of me. I'll talk to you guys later.